The first thing my mother said when I walked into the house was, "Just say you're driving." She didn't say hello. She didn't ask if I'd heard what happened. She didn't even look surprised to see me. She was standing beside the kitchen island with my father, my sister Colleen, and a man in a navy suit I'd never seen before. On the counter sat a stack of papers, a pen, and a glass of water nobody had touched. I looked at the papers, then at Colleen. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "What happened?" I asked. My father exhaled like I was making this harder than it needed to be. "Colleen had an accident." I looked at my sister again. She finally raised her eyes. "I hit someone," she whispered. For a second, nobody spoke. Then my mother stepped closer. "He's alive," she said quickly. "He's in the hospital." But this could destroy Colleen's campaign. That was when I understood. They weren't gathered there because they were worried about the man she'd hit. They were gathered because they were trying to decide whose life could be sacrificed to protect hers. My father pushed the papers toward me. "The vehicle is registered to you," he said. "If you were driving, this can be explained." I stared at the first page. My name was already typed across the top. There was even a blank line waiting for my signature. I looked at my mother. "You already wrote my statement?" She didn't flinch. "We're trying to protect the family." I almost laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because they had spent years making me feel like the least important person in the family. And somehow they had still decided I was important enough to carry my sister's crime. My father leaned forward. "She has a campaign. You have nothing to lose." That sentence stayed with me. Not because it hurt. Because it told me exactly how they saw me. And none of them knew what I had spent the last several years becoming. They thought I worked in a courthouse. They thought I filed papers, went home, and kept my life small. They had never asked what I actually did there. And that night, I had no intention of telling them. Not yet. I picked up the first page. It described a sequence of events that had never happened. According to the statement, I had taken my SUV earlier that evening. I had been distracted. I had struck the pedestrian. I had panicked. It was clean. Almost too clean. The kind of story someone writes after deciding what they need the truth to look like. "Who drafted this?" I asked. The attorney answered. "I did." "And you've discussed it with the police?" "Not yet." My mother folded her arms. "That is why you're here." I looked at Colleen. She still hadn't said a word. I asked her the simplest question I could think of. "Where were you when it happened?" She swallowed. "I was driving." My father immediately cut in. Colleen was upset. "She isn't thinking clearly." I looked at him. "So she was driving." Nobody answered. That silence told me more than the confession ever could. The attorney opened another folder. "We have a second version." I stared at him. "A second version?" He slid another document across the counter. The timeline had changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. Different wording. Different sequence. Different explanation for why the vehicle had been where it was. I looked from one page to the other. Then I looked at my family. They had prepared multiple versions of my guilt. That was the moment something inside me became very still. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to scream. And I wasn't going to sign anything. Because there was one thing they didn't understand. I had spent years watching people turn small inconsistencies into major findings. I knew what happened when a story had to be changed depending on who was asking the questions. And I knew that the truth didn't need revisions. I placed both statements back on the counter. "I need to think about this." My mother frowned. "There isn't time." "I know." She reached for my arm. "You're our daughter. Colleen needs you." I gently pulled away. "No," I said. "She needs the truth." The room went silent. My father looked at me like he'd never heard me speak that way before. Maybe he hadn't. I walked out of that house without signing anything. Before sunrise, I called an attorney. Not a family attorney. Not someone my parents knew. Someone who had never met Colleen, never attended one of our holidays, and had no reason to care about my family's reputation. I told him exactly what had happened. I told him about the accident. I told him Colleen had been driving my SUV. And I told him my family had prepared a confession with my name on it. He didn't interrupt me. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then he asked, "Did you sign anything?" "No." "Did you tell investigators you were driving?" "No." "Good." That single word made me realize how close I had come to letting their panic become my problem. He asked me to send him photographs of the documents my family had prepared. I did. Then he asked a question I hadn't considered. "Where is the vehicle now?" "At my parents' house." "Don't touch it." I paused. "What?" "Don't move it. Don't clean it. Don't remove anything. Don't try to prove anything yourself. From this point forward, we preserve what exists and let the appropriate people handle the evidence." That was exactly what I needed to hear. Because I knew something my family didn't. The truth doesn't become stronger because you shout it louder. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is leave the evidence exactly where it is. By breakfast, my mother had already called 3 times. I didn't answer. Then my father sent a message. "We need to fix this before police make this worse." I stared at the screen. Not before Colleen gets arrested. Not before we find out what happened. Before police make this worse. I put the phone face down. A few minutes later, my attorney called. He had started the process of preserving the vehicle through the appropriate legal and insurance channels. I didn't go back to my parents' house. I didn't touch the SUV. And I didn't call anyone connected to the investigation. That distinction mattered. Because whatever happened next had to be established independently. Not because I couldn't influence things. Because I refused to. That afternoon, my mother finally reached me. Her voice was quieter this time. "Your father says you're making a huge mistake." "I haven't made a statement. You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand exactly what's at stake." "No, Iris. You don't." She started crying. Then came the sentence I'd heard in different forms my entire life. "Your sister needs you." I closed my eyes. For years, that sentence had meant sacrifice. Give up your plans. Give up your time. Give up your money. Give up your comfort. And now they wanted me to give up my freedom. I said, helping Colleen doesn't mean claiming responsibility for something she did. My mother went silent. Then she whispered, "She's scared." "So am I. But you're stronger." I almost answered. Instead, I said, "Being stronger doesn't make me guilty." Then I ended the call. 2 days later, I learned that Colleen had already spoken to investigators. Her account was careful. Very careful. She didn't directly say I had been driving. She didn't have to. She described the evening in a way that placed my presence close enough to the timeline that someone unfamiliar with the family could easily draw the wrong conclusion. That was when I understood what my parents had been doing. They weren't simply asking me to lie. They were building a version of events where they could later say they had never actually lied themselves. And that was far more dangerous. My attorney told me not to confront them. So I didn't. Instead, I waited. Because somewhere inside that SUV was a record of what had actually happened. And if the proper investigators could obtain it independently, my family's story would have to survive something they couldn't control. The facts. I still hadn't told my parents what I did for a living. They knew I worked in a courthouse. They assumed that meant paperwork. They had never asked what happened after I walked through the doors marked United States District Court. They never asked why my schedule was sometimes unpredictable. They never asked why I had security protocols they didn't understand. And they certainly never asked why, years earlier, I had quietly taken an oath that had changed my life. I was a federal judge. My family had spent years believing I was the least powerful person at their table. That night, I finally understood something. They weren't going to discover my position because I wanted to impress them. They were going to discover it because the truth was becoming impossible to hide. The next morning, I made the call I had been trying not to make. Not to my parents. Not to the police. To the person who handled ethics matters for judges. I explained everything from the beginning. My sister had been driving my vehicle. A man had been struck. My family wanted me to claim I had been behind the wheel. And now there was a criminal investigation. There was a long silence after I finished. Then came the question I had expected. "Judge Ashford, Are you personally involved in the investigation? No. Have you contacted any investigator? No. Have you used your position to obtain information? No. Good. Keep it that way. I understood immediately. My title could not become another weapon in the family argument. If anything, it had to become a wall between me and the investigation. I agreed not to contact investigators, prosecutors, or anyone involved in the case. I would not use my office. I would not make calls. I would not ask for favors. My attorney would handle everything that could properly be handled through counsel. For the first time since the accident, I felt like I could breathe. There was a clear line. On one side was my responsibility as a judge. On the other was my responsibility as a citizen who had been falsely accused. I could do both without confusing them. My parents didn't understand any of that. That evening, my father called again. You've made this much bigger than it needed to be. I asked how. You got a lawyer. Yes. You're refusing to cooperate with the family. I am refusing to lie. He sighed. You're being dramatic. No. I'm being careful. He lowered his voice. Colleen's campaign is already taking questions. There it was again. The campaign. Always the campaign. Not the injured man. Not the truth. Not even Colleen. The campaign. I said, Dad, if the truth destroys her campaign, the problem isn't the truth. He hung up. I sat there for a while, staring at the phone. Then my attorney called. The vehicle is being preserved. I said nothing. He continued. There's potentially useful electronic information associated with it. We are not going to access anything ourselves. If investigators need it, they'll obtain it through the appropriate process. That was exactly what I wanted. No shortcuts. No secret retrieval. No evidence that could later be attacked because I had touched it. Let the investigators find it. Let them document it. Let them explain what it showed. My only job was to tell the truth. A few days later, the investigation changed direction. I didn't know every detail. I wasn't supposed to, but I knew enough. The vehicle information could establish where the SUV had been and when. And forensic details could be compared against the family's version of events. Suddenly, the confession my mother had pushed across that kitchen counter didn't look like protection anymore. It looked like a liability. Because they had created a written story before they knew what the evidence would say. And evidence has a stubborn quality. It doesn't care who your father knows. It doesn't care who is running for office. It doesn't care which version sounds better at dinner. It simply sits there, waiting to be interpreted. Then I learned something else. Because of the political connections surrounding my sister, the matter was moving toward independent prosecutorial oversight. That was the moment I knew the family's biggest advantage was disappearing. They had counted on familiarity, connections, people knowing people. But an independent prosecutor doesn't have the same reason to protect a family name. Suddenly, the question wasn't, can Iris be convinced to take the blame? It was, what actually happened? That was the question I had wanted from the beginning. My mother called one last time before the hearing. Her voice was almost unrecognizable. Please, she said. Whatever happens, don't destroy your sister. I sat quietly. Then I answered. I didn't do this to Colleen. She started crying. You're still her sister. Yes. And you love her. I looked down at the documents on my desk. I do. Then help her. I am. She didn't understand. Maybe she never would. Because helping someone doesn't always mean protecting them from consequences. Sometimes it means refusing to help them bury the truth. I ended the call. Then I opened the file my attorney had prepared. There was one thing left. My sworn statement. And once I signed it, there would be no family version anymore. There would only be the record. The sworn statement sat in front of me for almost 10 minutes before I picked up the pen. Not because I was afraid of telling the truth. Because I knew exactly what telling it would cost. Once my statement became part of the record, there would be no taking it back. My family couldn't call it a misunderstanding. They couldn't say I had changed my story because I was angry. The truth would be there. In writing. Under oath. I signed. My statement was simple. I wasn't driving. Colleen was. I described where I had been that evening, what I knew about the vehicle, and what happened when my family asked me to take responsibility. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't speculate. I didn't accuse anyone of things I couldn't personally establish. I simply told the truth. Then I stepped back. The rest had to happen through the investigation. The vehicle data came next. Investigators obtained the information independently and compared it with the statements already given. The results didn't match the story my family had created. The timeline placed the SUV where it had been reported. The vehicle information supported the sequence I had described. And the forensic evidence provided another layer of corroboration. For the first time, I wasn't the only person saying Colleen had been driving. The evidence was saying it too. That changed everything. Because my family could call me bitter. They could call me disloyal. They could even claim I had misunderstood what happened. But they couldn't dismiss independently obtained records simply because they didn't like what those records showed. I remember sitting outside the hearing room that morning. My attorney sat beside me. Neither of us spoke much. Then the doors opened. I walked inside. My parents were already there. My mother looked exhausted. My father wouldn't look at me. Colleen sat between them. For the first time since the accident, she looked smaller than I remembered. Not innocent. Not powerful. Just scared. The prosecutor reviewed the evidence. Then I was asked to give my account. I stood. And I started at the beginning. No dramatic pauses. No accusations. Just the timeline. Where I had been. Where the vehicle had been. What I learned afterward. What my family asked me to do. And what I refused to do. As I spoke, I watched my father's face change. Not when I mentioned my job. Not when I mentioned the accident. It changed when the evidence was placed beside the statements they had prepared. Because suddenly, their carefully written story wasn't protecting anyone. It was contradicting the record. My mother looked at me once. There was something in her expression I hadn't seen before. Not anger. Not disappointment. Recognition. She finally understood that I hadn't been bluffing when I refused to sign. I hadn't been trying to punish Colleen. I had simply refused to become the person they needed me to be. The prosecutor continued. The independent evidence supported my account. The inconsistencies in the family's version became impossible to ignore. And the room went quiet. That was the moment the entire strategy collapsed. Not because I had revealed some secret power. Not because I had threatened anyone. But because they had built their defense around a lie that required me to participate. And I had stopped participating. Afterward, Colleen's attorney approached us. There was no dramatic confrontation. No apology. No shouting. Just a quiet conversation about what would happen next. The case was moving forward. The evidence was clear. And my sister finally had to make a decision she had avoided from the beginning. Accept responsibility. Or continue fighting a version of events that the evidence no longer supported. She chose to accept responsibility. Her campaign was finished. The legal consequences were no longer something my parents could transfer onto me. They belonged to the person who had actually caused the accident and left the scene. The case didn't end with the hearing. It ended with consequences. Colleen eventually accepted a felony plea related to leaving the scene of the accident. The political campaign she had spent years building was over, and the legal consequences were hers to face. My parents had wanted a simple solution. They wanted me to sign a statement, protect Colleen, and let the family move on. Instead, they had to live with a very different reality. Colleen had to answer for what she had done. The attorney, who had helped construct the competing versions of my confession, also came under professional scrutiny. And my parents? They were left with the one thing they had tried hardest to avoid. The truth. A few weeks later, my mother called. I almost didn't answer. When I did, she didn't mention the case. She didn't mention Colleen's campaign. She didn't even apologize. She said, "Your father thinks we should try to put this behind us." I looked out the window. Put what behind us? She was quiet. The whole thing. I knew what she meant. She wanted the family to return to normal. But there was no normal anymore. Not after I'd seen how quickly they had decided. My freedom was worth less than Colleen's reputation. I said, I don't want to fight with you. My mother sighed with relief. Then I continued. But I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen. Her voice became defensive. We were scared. I know. We thought we were protecting your sister. I know. You could have helped us. I paused. I did help you. She didn't respond. I told the truth. That was the end of the conversation. I never told my parents that I had become a federal judge, because I wanted them to admire me. By the time they found out, their opinion didn't matter nearly as much as it once had. For years, I had quietly accepted the role they'd given me. The dependable daughter. The one who could handle more. The one who didn't need much. The one who would understand. But there is a difference between being dependable and being disposable. My family had confused the two. That was their mistake. And maybe mine was allowing them to believe it for so long. Colleen and I eventually spoke again. It wasn't dramatic. There was no movie-style apology. She didn't suddenly become a different person. She simply admitted something I already knew. She had been afraid. Afraid of losing her campaign. Afraid of disappointing our parents. Afraid of what would happen if she admitted what she'd done. And when people are afraid enough, they sometimes look for the person they believe will absorb the consequences for them. She thought that person was me. I told her I understood why she was scared. But understanding wasn't forgiveness. And forgiveness wasn't the same thing as trust. If there was ever going to be a relationship between us again, it would have to be built on something neither of us had been willing to demand before. Honesty. The strange part is that my title never actually saved me. Being a federal judge didn't make the truth true. It didn't make the evidence stronger. It didn't make my sister guilty. And it certainly didn't give me the right to interfere with an investigation. What mattered was that I refused to lie. I allowed the proper process to work. I kept my role separate. And I let independent evidence establish what had happened. That's why the outcome mattered to me. Not because my family finally discovered that I had power, but because they finally discovered that I didn't need to use power against them. They had already created the path that led to the truth. I simply stopped walking the path they had chosen for me. The last time I saw my father, he said something I never expected. You really never told us? I knew what he meant. No. Why? I thought about that for a moment. There were 100 possible answers. I could have told him that they never asked. I could have told him that I didn't trust them with that part of my life. I could have told him that after years of being treated like the least important person in the family, I stopped needing their approval. Instead, I said, because I wanted one thing in my life that belonged only to me. He nodded slowly. Neither of us said anything else. And strangely, I was okay with that. I used to think justice meant making people understand what they had done to you. Now I think it's simpler than that. Justice is refusing to carry consequences that don't belong to you. My family thought I had nothing to lose. They were wrong. I had a career, a reputation, a life, a future. And most importantly, I had the truth. The night my mother pushed that confession across the table, she thought she was asking me to save my sister. What she was really asking was whether I would betray myself to keep my family comfortable. I said no. I didn't expose them. I didn't destroy them. I didn't need to. I simply told the truth and stepped aside. And once I did, everything they had built around a lie collapsed on its own. That was the day I stopped being the daughter my family could sacrifice, and became the woman who finally understood that I never had to earn the right to protect my own life.